Well, hello, hello. Good to see you guys again. I am really excited about today. Today, we are going to start a new book together. And honestly, this is the first time we've ever had to do this virtually, but I think it's still going to just be fine. There were a couple of books that I wanted to read. I don't know that we're going to get to both of them, but we are going to get to this one. This one is called James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. This is one of my favorite books. When I was a kid, you guys, many of you know, I was kind of a reluctant reader, and there weren't a lot of books that really piqued my interest, but I do remember loving this book when I was about your age. So we're going to be reading this together, and my plan is that we get through this book in 3 weeks. That's totally doable. This book goes by really quickly, and even though it sounds like a lot, like we're going to be doing 13 chapters about every week, that sounds like a lot, but the chapters are actually pretty small. Some of them are really, really small. But I think you guys are going to love this. And then in conjunction with reading, with our daily readings that we're going to be doing, I have this little packet here for you as well. And this is to be used, as we read. It's separated into chapters. So, we'll be working on chapters 1 through 3 maybe today. And that's it. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start. And there's some pictures in here too. So I'll be showing you those pictures. If you can, see if you can get a copy of this. I don't know if you can get like maybe an electronic copy of it, through Kindle, for one of those apps, or if you could get a copy of it through Amazon. I know Amazon's really been kind of slow lately, so I don't know if you'll get it. But even if you don't get a copy or don't have a copy, it's okay. I'm going to be reading this to you, and so hopefully it all goes well. Okay, so here we go. James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Chapter 1. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was the sandy beach for him to run on and an ocean to paddle on. It was a perfect life for a small boy. Then one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up in full daylight, mind you, on a crowded street by an enormous, angry rhinoceros, which had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were over in a jiffy. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened and in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I am sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nuisance," or "you miserable creature," and they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, on a queer ramshackle house on top of a high hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden, James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see the tiny gray dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved mother and father. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, a thin line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. Here's a kind of a picture of the house that he was living in with Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. But James was never allowed to go off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself. not even for a small walk or a picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden, Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared climb over the fence. The garden, which was covered the whole on top of the hill, was large and desolate. The only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing or seesaw, no sand pit, and no other children were ever invited to come up to the hill and play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company, and as time went on, he became sadder and sadder and more lonely. And he used to spend hours a day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. So that was chapter 1. That was a sad chapter, wasn't it? It's okay. Things get better for James, I promise. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I will say was only rather peculiar, soon caused something to happen that was very peculiar. And then the very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing that occurred. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker and James were out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker sitting comfortably on the deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop working for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy ears and a sunken mouth and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though she had been boiled. She was like a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony. She wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips. And whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting through her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these 2 ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and then screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror in her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. There's a part that's coming up, which you guys were dealing with some poetry last time. There was that little poetry section that you probably have turned in by now, but remember, there in poetry we've got rhyme. And a lot of times there's rhyme patterns. So I want you to see if you can hear for what the pattern is so you can predict what's going to be coming up as far as the upcoming pattern. Also be aware of the rhythm of this poem, and hopefully I can read it correctly so you can actually hear that. But be aware of the rhythm, and these are all things that we want to take a look at when we're looking at poetry. Okay, so here we go. This is Aunt Sponge. I look and smell, Aunt Sponge declared, as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face, observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks, and if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget, Aunt Spiker cried, how much your tummy shows. Aunt Sponge went red, Aunt Spiker said, my sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beautimous me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the pimple on my chin. My dear old trout, Aunt Sponge cried out, you're only bones and skin. Such a loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood, Aunt Sponge declared. Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'll capture the nation's hearts. They'll give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign. I think you'd make, Aunt Spiker said, a lovely Frankenstein. Nice people, huh? Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wildflowers, and all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed with his own unhappiness. And there's a picture of poor James. What's the matter with you? Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast, Aunt Sponge ordered. Oh, Aunt Sponge, James cried out. Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all, please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awfully lonely. Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute, Aunt Spiker shouted. Beat him, cried Aunt Sponge. I certainly will, Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. I shall beat you later in the day when I don't feel so hot, she said. And now, get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace. James turned and ran. He ran as fast and as he could and as far to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind a clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. I know, it is sad. These are two sad chapters, but it does get better, I promise. Okay, that was chapter 2. One more chapter for today, chapter 3. It was at this point that the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many much more peculiar things, happened to him. For suddenly behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, and he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly whiskers. He stopped when he was 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on a stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. Come closer to me, little boy, he said, beckoning James with a finger. Come right up to me, and I will show you something wonderful. So you might want to pause right here and kind of think, well, is this somebody James should trust? And, if so, what's going to happen next? And then you might even ask, does he have anything to lose? I mean, life is really, really terrible for him with as it is. So we've got to make some predictions here. James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into his pocket, and out of his jacket he took out a small white paper bag. Okay, here's a picture of that. You see this? He whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in James's face. You know what this is, my dear? You know what's inside this little bag? Then he came near still, leaning forward and pushing his face so close that James could feel his breath blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mild wood, like air in an old cellar. Take a look, my dear. he said, opening the bag, tilting it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and they were the strangest bright. There was a strangest brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality, which means they were glowing. That made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. Listen to them, the old man whispered. Listen to them move. James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was the faint rustling, that sound coming from inside it. And then he noticed that all the thousands of tiny little green things were slowly, very, very slowly stirring about and moving over each other as though they were alive. There's more power and magic in those little things than there are in the rest of the world put together, the old man said softly. But what are they? James murmured, finding his voice at last. Where do they come from? Aha, the old man whispered. You'll never guess that. He crouched a little now and pushed his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin on James's forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. Crocodile tongues, he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights, with the eyeballs of a lizard, and the fingers of a young monkey, and gizzard of a pig, and the beak of a green parrot, and the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for a week, and then let the moon do the rest. All at once he pushed the white paper bag into James's hands and said, Here, you take it. It's yours. And that's where we're going to leave off today. So James and the Giant Peach, we've read a lot of different books. We started with Because of Winn-Dixie. That would be like what we would call maybe a realistic fiction book. We read Island of the Blue Dolphins, which was more of a historical fiction book. And I would say the last one that we read, By the Great Horn Spoon, was also probably a good example of a historical fiction, so it was set in the gold rush. This is different from the 3 of those in that this is kind of a fantasy genre. And so what typically happens with fantasy books is that you've got, kind of strange creatures, which we're definitely going to see coming up in the next few chapters. Sometimes animals that talk. There's usually good versus evil involved, and I think we can already see that that's in play with, James being the good little force, and Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spike are just being, just terrible, evil people. So we see elements already that this would be an example of a type of a fantasy book. So this book is quite an adventure. There's a lot of ground to cover. Like I said, we're probably going to do about 3 chapters a day. So try to stay up with us. I will be posting these videos. They will be, of course, in our Google Classroom, but I'll also be putting them on our Classroom website, which hopefully you guys have been able to have access to. And as that continues, as we continue doing what we're doing and kind of doing this remote learning, I'll be adding to that, and that will be just kind of a place where you can find resources like these videos and all that. So anyway, I hope you guys are doing well, and I really do miss you, and we will talk to you later. I'll see you tomorrow with another few chapters of James and the Giant Peach. Have a good one, guys. Bye.